We are very pleased to welcome you back at the Henry George School for our webinar, Poverty Perpetuation, Dynamics, Mechanisms, and Reforms. Our speaker tonight is Nishu Mehrish, a PhD candidate in economics at the New School for Social Research in New York. She has a long career in teaching and mentoring in economics. She's passionate about using education as a tool to uplift the underprivileged and those with special needs. Her background as an educator in India has familiarized her with the deep-rooted issues of poverty and inequality, and the necessity of inclusivity and diversity to ensure equality with social justice. As a graduate student, her research interests are focused on the comparative analysis of poverty traps within developed and developing economies, with a special emphasis on the correlation between climate change and poverty traps. So, Nishu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ibrahima, for introducing me. And thank you, Henry George School of Social Sciences, for inviting me and for setting this up. Before I begin talking about my essay on poverty perpetuation, dynamics and mechanisms and reforms, I would like to extend my gratitude to Professor Willy Semler for his valuable mentorship and guidance through my research for this paper. Poverty is generally understood as the deprivation of necessities. It is a state of not having enough money to meet basic needs, including food, clothing, and shelter. It is a harsh reality today that nearly 9.2% of the world's population, with 712 million people, according to the World Bank, are struggling to strive on less than $2.15 a day. Coming from a developing economy, I believed that poverty was driven by lack of economic resources and was confined to developing nations. But to my surprise, this phenomena is prevalent in developed economies in multiple forms. I have been intrigued to know more about this multifaceted crisis, which has gripped millions of people across the globe. And this paper is an endeavor to investigate, identify, and analyze the multiple determinants of poverty, the reasons for its perpetuation, and its impact on economic growth. As a part of my research, Professor Semler introduced me to Sir Henry George's book, Progress and Poverty, which provided me an insight that is distinct from the traditional assumption of poverty led by the lack of investment or capital accumulation. There are two pertinent questions from Sir Henry George's book that have driven me to delve deeper into exploring the issues related to poverty amidst plenty. The first one, why has the progress of modern technology, social services, and education failed to alleviate poverty? And the second, why does growing wealth of industrialized economies tend to stay concentrated in the hands of the few? The intuition behind this essay has been to explore the problem of poverty, which is both a cause and a consequence of rapid population growth, migration, daily environmental degradation, and so much more. These forces converge to create a relentless cycle, trapping individuals and entire nations in a poverty trap from which there seems to be no escape. This cycle is not just about lack of resources. It is about the lack of opportunities, hope, and a future. Poverty is a self-perpetuating vicious cycle, a cycle that breeds inequality and social stratification. It is rooted in various factors, which may be social, political, economic, and even geographical. When one person or community suffers a disadvantage, it can quickly grow into a cycle of poverty, affecting the entire community and hence the economy. Spread over 3 sections, this essay is an inquiry and assessment of the circular relationship between the causes and consequences of poverty, that triggered a trap for sustained economic stagnation and deprivation. The first section, Outset of Poverty Traps, explores the various contributing factors to the existence of poverty and its persistence. It explores how economies suffer from the polarization of income and get caught in the endless loop of remaining poor. This section also attempts to review poverty thresholds and takeoffs that correspond to global issues in the contemporary world, which resonates with Sir Henry George's doctrine of poverty amidst plenty. I also investigate poverty's correlation with ecological imbalance and climate change to highlight the threat to sustainable development. The second section, Poverty Traps Mechanism through the lens of growth models, I view poverty from the lens of economic growth in economies at the global level. Using different variables as exogenous or endogenous, these theories explain the causality of this persistent state that economies suffer from. Since every economy may fall into this self-perpetuating loop for different reasons, they must focus on the specific factors at play to break free from this cycle and avoid any cause and effect pitfall. This section runs from classical perspective to modern viewpoint of economic growth, failing which the economies remain caught in the poverty traps. The third section is the concluding section that assesses how poverty appears in multiple dimensions and has been perceived as the most complex and pressing issue of all times. The essay concludes with an agreement with Sir Henry George's views that poverty exists because of inequalities and injustice in our societies. Reviewing some growth models and theories from the classical to the modern era, this essay advocates for sustainable poverty reduction measures and maintains that economic growth is the single most important factor that influences poverty, provided it is coupled with equitable distribution of the benefits of economic growth. Moving on to the details, we have now the first section. Since economies across the globe have different macroeconomic performances, the poverty perpetuation may result from specific and varied series of events and mechanisms in different regions and economies. To understand the dynamics of poverty traps, it is essential to know what causes this socio-economic global phenomena. There has been a significant transition in the viewpoints of scholars and economists about the causation of poverty for centuries. Economists and scholars have figured out different reasons for its emergence and perpetuation. Where Adam Smith considered poverty as lacking the resources to sustain life, Robert Malthus proclaimed that the mismatch between the population and the food supply was the reason for poverty and suffering. Karl Marx, on the other hand, considered poverty as the product of historically specific modes of production, in contrast to Malthusian theory. The Marxians believe that poverty is an inevitable consequence of a capitalist society and a direct outcome of the inequality inherent in the class system. In the year 1879, Sir Henry George, in his book Progress and Poverty, established the simultaneous advancement of poverty and wealth. He refuted Malthusian thought that increase in population tends to reduce wages and produce poverty. He stressed on the reason for poverty existence amidst technological advancements that created more prosperous societies and argued that poverty exists because of inequalities and injustice in our society. He believed that a political system in which human beings are theoretically equal was based on a foundation of social inequality. Sir George asserted that economics focuses on money and employment and disregards natural resources where these two factors are engaged. Land with all its resources, the minerals, oil, gas, coal, metals, etc., which are under the soil, was an important factor and was owned disproportionately and allowed owners of land to generate wealth using labor and capital. Wealth disparity arising from unequal land ownership distribution created social justice. He also alleged that leaders in most societies illegally amassed wealth and ignored poverty in setting priorities, and that caused all ills. In Sir Henry George's views, land should be made a common property and not be monopolized. The problem of poverty amidst plenty, the corrupt relations between wealth and political power, and the suffocated social order that the world today faces aligns with what Sir Henry George sought to address 150 years ago. This is the second section of second part of the first section, where I'm going to talk about the poverty thresholds and takeoffs. There is no denying the fact that a large population is suffering from deprivation amidst technological upgradation and scientific development. Developed countries with strong economies also have a significant number of people who are struggling to survive amidst plenty. The causes of poverty are extremely complicated, with different factors contributing to the problem. Lack of industrial and technological advancement, failure of growing markets, lack of human capital formation and financial development, poor capital formation, or it may be demographic structure and social norms, climate change, and even polarization of income. All these account for multiple causes of poverty, and all these are beyond just lack of necessities. This part of the section deals with such contemporary issues that led economies to the state of poverty. Here I have the wealth gap. We know that income inequalities are the most important poverty increasing factor. Polarization and unequal distribution of income and wealth are chronic miseries that give rise to both wealth accumulation and with the few and poverty at large. Poverty is a consequence of how society is organized and resources are allocated. The disparity of cumulative assets across races and ethnicities in an economy also drag them to a situation of persistent poverty. The reality is that almost half of the world's population, almost half of the world's wealth is now owned by just 1% of the population, amounting to $110 trillion, which is 65 times the total wealth of the bottom half of the world's population. In this equation, which you can see here, the WT and WT plus 1 denote the average wealth in time T and T plus 1 of the wealth group. YT denotes their average labor income in time T. R denotes the average rate of return of their portfolio. Q denotes the average capital gain rate, which is the difference between the average increase in the price of assets and inflation. And S denotes the saving rate in the same time. This equation makes it possible to calculate saving rates based on other values observed. The per capita labor income of people in an economy in the current time T evolves with the growth rate. The accumulation of per capita wealth is determined by the rate of saving by the households, capital gains, and return on their wealth. And since poor have low saving rate, low capital gains, and low rate of returns on their wealth, ultimately decides the absence of accumulation of wealth with them over time. The lack of protection of property rights, like expropriation of private wealth, corruption in the system, excessive taxation, and barriers to the adoption of new technology also results in slow economic growth. Similar to that, a poor political setup affects the lives of the poorest and most vulnerable people. When governments fail to provide basic safety and essential services, it harms the poor even more. Political turmoils, corruption, the judicial system, racial, gender, and ethnic discriminations the public-private coordination, all are directly related to how politics affects poverty. The economic, political, and social inequalities lead to severe consequences of trapping people in a cycle of poverty that is very hard to escape from. Then the low-income countries have a poor public-private partnership, as there is a reluctance between the two sectors to work in collaboration. As the data goes, the involvement of the private is just over 10% in lower middle income and just over 5% in low income countries. Government alone cannot provide pro-poor benefits to the vulnerable section. The private sector can help create a sustainable impact by changing the economic status of the poor. It is not only for the provision of basic infrastructure, but also for food security and even finance. The efficiency of the government sector can be increased by using management skills and the innovative drive of the private sector. The public-private partnerships are an instrument to respond to market failures and also help minimize the risk of government failure. And besides all this partnership can help improve infrastructure, spur economic growth that eventually reaches the poor by way of trickle-down effect. Human activities have created a massive disaster in terms of climate change. This forces us to ponder over these issues. Does climate change pose a constant threat to the livelihood and well-being of people? Is it posing a risk for the non-poor to become vulnerable to poverty? Can climate change have any impact on the ability of the poor to escape poverty? Climate change is a serious obstacle to the sustained alleviation of poverty. Poverty causes environmental damage that in turn poses a serious threat to humanity. People living in poverty bear a brunt of environmental damage and are often caught in a downward spiral where they are forced to overuse resources to survive. Impacting ecological balance, flora and fauna, investment and consumption, productivity and prices, asset accumulation, and even survival, climate change acts as a threat multiplier. It intensifies resource scarcity and worsens existing social economic and environmental factors, not only for the current population, but also for the generations to come. Next, I have the financial market constraints. The multiple financial market failures depict the deprivation of those who suffer low initial endowments and who suffer a shock that hits them below some critical asset threshold. In case of initial market failure, individuals cannot borrow against their future income, either to accumulate assets more rapidly or to insulate consumption against the effects of shock. These borrowing constraints represent the first financial market failure. If there is no insurance, both the market and the individuals have no way to compensate for their asset loss. Then such market failures affect poor people's lives, trapping them into the persistence of poverty, unless the economy reaches a higher scale of production with higher technology, ensuring greater output. With this, I move to the second section of the paper, which is poverty traps mechanism through the lens of growth models. Economic growth is believed to be playing an important role in reducing poverty trap if the poor participate and share the process and proceedings of growth. Where poverty can create a vicious circle, growth can generate virtuous cycle of prosperity and opportunity, as economic growth means producing more goods and services with the same amount of resources. There are a lot of different theories which conceptualize growth and how economic growth can be achieved. These theories attempt to explain conditions that are essential for development and growth to happen. They focus on understanding economic growth and also seek to find determinants and alternatives that, causes of growth, like how can growth be achieved. In this section, through these theories, I have tried to explain the causality of this persistent vulnerable state that economies are facing. I have also addressed how these endogenous and exogenous factors used in these growth models help economies grow, failing which the economies stay in the perpetual state of stagnation and hence become vulnerable. Starting with the classical perspective, I have Adam Smith's growth model. Smith's growth model is based on the potential for increasing returns in the manufacturing that is generated by first the increasing specialization and division of labor, and second upon the accumulation of real capital, which is necessary to support the greater division of labor. This figure depicts how the expansion of market as a result of increase in capital and production leads to higher factor productivity and increasing returns to scale. This increases the surplus and hence more savings, which culminates into more capital and creates kind of a circular flow of growth in the economy. We have economists like Paul Rosenstein-Rodan, Regnar Nurkse, Gunnar Myrdal, and Walt Whitman Rostow, who argued that a nation can achieve increasing returns only when a country has achieved a particular threshold level of output and output per capita. The poor nations get trapped in poverty because they are unable to push themselves above that threshold, whereas the developing countries get a push over that threshold because of a massive and widespread injection of capital, and that's how they take off. Moving on to the traditional perspective, the Solo-Swan growth model explicitly explains the poverty trap, which suggests that per capita output growth results from capital accumulation and technological progress. Transitioning from the classical growth model, the neoclassical economists asserted that the economies can determine the long-run growth rate of output per capita. They related it to three variables: rate of technological change, saving to investment rate, and population growth rate. Based on the Cobb-Douglas production function, it is presumed that labor and capital are vital for short-run equilibrium, whereas technological change as an exogenous factor tends to offset the effects of diminishing returns that are accrued by the inputs of labor and capital. Here, this is a twin figure. Through his model, Solo tried to propound that without the exogenous, the input of technology, economies in the steady state operate at the output level of y star upon n, as you can see in the left-hand side figure on the y-axis, where the input is k star upon n. With the infusion of technology, an increase in the total factor productivity enables an increase in the saving that helps the economy reach a higher steady state and hence significant growth, which you can see in the right-hand side figure. This figure shows that now the steady state equilibrium arrives at the higher level with investment per worker, which is denoted as SFK prime upon N, increasing to ensure output per worker as Y prime upon N, as input per worker is denoted as K prime N, K prime upon N, if you can see in the figure. Then I have also tried to bring in the modern perspective, some models which are from the modern point of view. It is a modified model to that of Solo, which explains that economies at the international level have differences in growth rates that result from convergence to different steady states. The modern growth theory is based on the idea that growth is driven by factors inside the economy, and the production function needs to be adjusted to that. The production function looks like this. Y depends on A times the function of K, H, L, and I, which is the most important factor. I is the institutions or the environment in which the decisions are made in an economy. These institutions are in every economy help achieve economic growth endogenously. The economy with the same capital produces more with more efficiency because the institutions play a positive role in fostering long-term investments. This helps boost innovations in an economy. The economies that grow have introduced these positive institutions and reforms such as transparent and consistent government, private property rights, and stable money and prices. This pushes the production function up, holding the capital constant and cheaper methods to push up economic growth and develop infrastructure. Economies that have negative institutions like corruption, political instability, or lack of individual freedom restricts growth and hinders people from making decisions. Under the endogenous growth theories, different features are proposed as externalities that enhance the growth process. The accumulation of knowledge possessed by the firms is taken as information or knowledge, which is embodied in employees or by workers by way of human capital formation. The neoclassical model modified by N.G. Mankiw, David Romer, and David Well by adding human capital, R&D, and other externalities are additional inputs in the production of national income. Now, here I am going to talk about those factors that endogenously impact the economic growth. The first one is the externalities of investment. This is Schumpeter's concept of growth innovations. This model is about growth generated by innovations. According to Schumpeter, innovations result from entrepreneurial investments that are themselves motivated by the prospects of monopoly rents, and that innovations replace old technologies. In other words, growth involves creative destruction. This model analyzes that endogenous and sustained per capita growth is feasible. Schumpeter emphasized the role of entrepreneurship in driving economic development innovation. He argued that entrepreneurs, through their ability to innovate and introduce new products, processes the business models and are primary agents of economic process or the economic's progress. This implies that to initiate and ensure economic growth, economies must invest in capital stock with a greater increase in the human capital, and then only the decline in the marginal product of physical capital can be offset. Next, I have education and human capital. This endogenous model I've taken from Ozawa Luka's growth model, which is built on the idea that improvement in innovation, knowledge, and human capital lead to increased productivity. According to this model, knowledge, innovation, and human capital are all interrelated to each other in determining economic growth endogenously. Ozawa presumed that the annual output is determined by the existing capital stock and the quantity of labor employed in production. He classified this as internal effects of human capital, where the individual workers undergoing training become more productive, and external effects spill over and increase the productivity of capital and of other workers in the economy. It is the investment in human capital rather than the physical capital that has spillover effects that increase the level of technology. This is Romer's endogenous growth model. He considers technology changes to be endogenous, This model identifies a research sector that specializes in the production of ideas. This sector invokes human capital along with the existing stock of knowledge to produce ideas or new knowledge. The production function in this model shows that technology is endogenous, where more human capital is employed for the research and development of new designs. Then technology increases by a larger amount. And since it is assumed that technology is a non-rival input and partially excludable, there are positive spillover effects of technology that can be used by other firms. The growth model in this figure is set in continuous time and has two sectors. The final goods sector that creates output, and the research and development sector where the accumulation of knowledge happens. This model makes technological progress endogenous, and it is determined by the actions of the economic agents. And it is technological progress that in turn determines long-run growth in output per worker. Therefore, the production of new technology can be increased through the use of physical capital, human capital, and existing technology. So when improvements to human capital and existing knowledge are combined, they can create innovative ideas to enhance the production of goods in an economy. Innovative ideas are a very important part of economic growth, and technological advancement leads to economic improvements. I now have infrastructure and growth, their relationship. That's another booster in the growth potential of an economy. This figure reflects how the social infrastructures affect capital accumulation and human capital accumulation, which in turn affects the output per worker. Here, the public-private partnership comes in very handy. Good infrastructure has a positive impact on the durability of private capital and hence growth. The private sector can allocate its investments to those options that work as a stimulus to growth. The productivity of private capital depends largely on the state of public infrastructure. Growth in infrastructure has a multi-dimensional impact on economic growth, which we can see in the figure in the next slide. So, as we see in this figure, investment in infrastructure directly and indirectly support the production activity and productivity in farm and non-farm sectors, and eventually helps the economy in poverty reduction. All forces of economic growth essentially depend on public policy and how the state expenditure is planned as a fiscal expenditure. Specifically in low-income countries where the initial capital stock is low and basic infrastructure is lacking, the impact of infrastructural capital and investment is substantially large. Okay, now this is a little interesting. Besides the existing models of economic growth, which focus on external and internal factors, I have also added Gilor and Wells' unified theory here, which is a single framework that explains how internal factors within an economy can lead to changes in population and economic growth. They believe that these exogenous or endogenous models could not fully explain how human societies developed throughout history and did not accurately explain long-term development trends. They also overlooked the economic factors that caused the demographic transition. This led Oded Gallor to create a new unified theory that could explain the entire process of development in one framework. The unified growth model describes how economies can move from a period of slow growth and stagnation to a period of steady and sustained growth. He also explained that as technology advances, the populations grow, education becomes more important for keeping up with the changes. This shift led the fewer children being born and allowed some countries to invest more in improving their income per person, leading to long-term economic growth. Now, a lot of different models have been combined to explain this entire process. Initially, in the Malthusian stage, the economy grows slowly and remains stuck. Then, as the population grows and technology improves, the economy begins to grow faster. Eventually, in the modern stage, the economic growth becomes steady, with more wealth and better education leading to fewer children per family. In a way, the theory combines the ideas from earlier models like Malthus's theory, which emphasize the negative impact of population growth on income. It also considers how technological advances and capital growth can counteract these negative impacts, leading to overall development. To show the transition from the stagnation to one of a sustained growth economy, the model states that human traits, physical or mental, that are passed down through generations can lead to greater earning potential. These traits transfer to the offsprings and thus generates an evolutionary advantage and dominate the population. Investing in human skills and technological progress would bring a demographic transition and a shift to a sustained economic growth state. The theory also opens the door to further research to better understand how economies develop and how to use this knowledge for future policies. This model explains to explore how historical and ancient factors have influenced the global differences we see today. By studying the link between human evolution and economic development, we can gain new insights into how deep-rooted influences shape human skills and economic outcomes. This understanding could lead to better policies, which aim at promoting economic growth and reduce poverty worldwide. Various growth models explain the factors that act as exogenous or endogenous rationale for economic growth across countries. Here, at the very elementary level, I have tried to classify the poverty traps originating from low income, which may result because of the different factors. So I have taken here three factors. One is capital, is labor, and the technology. And this one is the poverty trap of capital. As any economic system requires a significant amount of capital to escape poverty, this trap is created because of low level of income, which induces a low level of saving, resulting in a low level of investment and hence low capital formation, and the low level of productivity coming back to a situation of low level of income. Moving on to the poverty trap of labor. Labor with low income people, they have low food intake, which results in their low productivity, and hence they land up in low income. Whereas the poverty trap of technology, the low level of income in an economy brings a low rate of research and development, which results in low economic growth and development, which eventually results in low level of income again. The graphical representation of poverty traps I have put in Appendix 2.5 of the paper, which portrays different growth models graphically. This part depicts the poverty trap at the micro individual level, showing that the amount of money a person has determines the quantum of food he can consume and the money he spends on health, education, ways to improve one's work, etc., which in turn influences his income in the future. In this figure, you can see in the left-hand side, the poverty trap is an S-shaped curve. In this figure, we try to show that the poor are stuck on the left-hand side of the diagonal line, whereas the rich are on the right-hand side. The right-hand side figure, if you see that, it represents a micro model and applies to economies at large at the macro level too. The basic needs line is E, if you can see that, the straight line that indicates expected expenditure, that divides the model into two parts, poor cycle and the rich cycle. Since commitments are bigger than income or assets, a person falls into the trap of debt and remains poor. That's on the left-hand side, where poverty begets poverty. On the contrary, the rich have more assets than the commitments they have. So they can save out of their income. Saving leads to investments and further leads to income. And this is how wealth begets wealth. Okay, coming to the concluding section of the essay, I think to conquer poverty, it is crucial to understand its realities. The causes and effects of poverty have to be handled to stop them from creating a downward spiral. We have learned that poverty is made up of multiple factors that are much more than just a lack of income. With about 9.5% population living in extreme poverty and caught in many self-reinforcing disadvantages such as deprivation, malnutrition, poor sanitation, lack of access to essential resources, and other social services. This makes it virtually impossible for these people to break the cycle. It is critical to help the world's poor lift themselves out of destitution, whatever form it may be, improve their standards of living, achieve better health and education, and attain greater control over their lives. All the growth models assign greater emphasis on the various factors that ensure higher economic growth. But growth alone cannot sufficiently, reduce poverty. Only if growth is associated with progressive distributional changes that would have a greater impact on poverty. The efforts to alleviate poverty do not mean poverty will vanish. According to Sandifer, even though extreme poverty is declining, we still have deep, untraceable pockets of poverty in many countries. But the efforts to alleviate poverty must go on. We must make policies to alleviate poverty with elements of social development and environmental stability. The 17 goals agenda by United Nations. These are United Nations member states, and this agenda is the world's shared plan to end extreme poverty, reduce inequality, and protect the planet by 2030. The UN Foundation focuses on initiatives that have larger impacts, aiming at leaving no one behind. These goals are an urgent call for nations to act at different levels of development in a global partnership. The aim to end poverty must not only make strategies to uplift human status, but also should be clubbed with tackling climate change and work to preserve our environment. These strategies must integrate economic and environmental considerations of environmental degradation as an outcome of both affluence and poverty at the global level, where developing countries need to invest in a comprehensive effort across macro, micro, and sectoral levels to address all of their many causes of being perpetually in poverty. The developed countries also need to play a proactive role and bear a larger burden to spend their wealth on conserving the environment. To fulfill these targets, I think economies need to make a public policy that aim at first, improvement in the distribution of income and assets within the society, and second, land tenure reforms, which are pro-poor public, aiming at pro-poor public expenditure and improvement in the poor's access to financial markets. That would ensure macroeconomic stability. The economies must work together, benefiting all segments of society, create equity with social justice, and bring modernization without stressing the environment and aim for self-reliance. No country can emerge out of poverty loop unless it ensures that all its available resources in any form are fully and efficiently used. keeping in mind the future generations' needs and happiness. And last but not the least, it is imperative that we understand this complex web of poverty not as an isolated issue, but as a global challenge that requires our collective action. With that, I come to the end of this presentation. I once again thank Henry George School of Social Sciences for this opportunity and Professor Willie Semler for making it possible for me to write this piece. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you so much.